I guess we're live.
Yes, we're live.
Hello.
All right, welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be your moderator for the Continuous Delivery Trends panel, and we're hoping to have a candid conversation today. I'll be joined by 4 others, and we're going to take turns introducing them one by one. So I'm going to start with Robert Nguyen from Salesforce. If you could introduce yourself and give people a little bit of background about your experience in this continuous delivery space.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, my name's Robert Nguyen. I've been with Salesforce about 4 years, a little more than 4 years. I've engaged in participate in multiple projects. They are around CI/CD. So I've been involved in designing, supporting, and execution of primarily deployment for application service into AWS environment.
Awesome. And we're also joined by Stefan Atwell. If you could let people know what your background is. I think you come from Armory. Give people a little bit about your background and what gives you your experience in the continuous delivery space.
So I'm one of the product managers at Armory. I previously was the product manager of our Policy Engine product. Currently, I'm working on an offering that is prepackaging a lot of common trends we're seeing across our customer base to simplify configuration of them, both with Spinnaker as well as for non-Spinnaker users. Before I came to Armory, I spent the last 12 years working in roles from product management to being a developer in SaaS. In other SaaS software companies, and before I moved into software, I was doing IT operations.
Awesome. And our next panelist is Tracy Miranda from the CD Foundation. Give people a little bit about who you are and your background.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, hi, I'm Tracy. I was the executive director of CDEF, and their CDF, as folks may or may not know, is the home of Jenkins, Spinnaker, Tecton, and many other open source projects. We also do a lot of research and released 2 reports around the state of continuous delivery with the idea of just helping people understand where the space is going, what barriers they are, and how they can be tackling them to get better at software delivery. And
awesome. Awesome. And our final panelist is John Esposito from DZone. If you could give people a little bit about who you are and your background.
Hey, everyone. I'm a software developer by day, college professor, and a software engineering researcher by night. So in the day job, I'm actually a title is technical architect, but I'm the comment writes code in enterprise consulting. A lot of our code actually runs in the Salesforce platform, the SaaS platform, the Apex runtime. But we also do like Java and .NET stuff. For DZone, actually, the reason I'm in this panel is because over the past number of years, actually like 6 or 7 years, we've been conducting developer-focused research on delivery practices. And so there's a little bit different perspective there that I'd like to offer.
Awesome. So I just want to let everyone know that's in attendance today live. We do have live Q&A, so you can hit the Ask a Question button. I'll be monitoring those throughout the session, and I'll feed those to the various people on the panel. So don't be shy, ask your questions, and we'll weave them in throughout the rest of the hour. So I do have a few setup questions here for us, and I'll dig deeper through these. One of the questions we have, and I guess kind of gets to the heart of why is this so hard? At least when I joined this whole space, people have been trying to do CI/CD, some better than others. So the first question that we have is, why do you think only 14% of developers are able to get code from check-in to production every day? And then what are the common challenges you see in achieving this? Like, what would be your approach? And maybe we start with Robert.
Yeah, sure. I guess the first thing from what my observation is to first is what the impact once you do more frequent deployments. I assume you can check in code, and today I say within 24 hours get into production. Just like suppose you can are able to do that, but what are the impact and how easy for us to validate the changes? It's never easy for in Salesforce example, we have other application service and their customers operating very critical service. So how comfortable, the comfort level sometimes is not easy to define, or achieve. How easily can we deploy things we know it won't break anything? and how easy it is to recover because our customer, let's say, they're operating a hospital or operating critical retail service commerce. There's some trust issue involved here, right? I mean, if something break, then how would the relationship with customers? So that when you deploy things quickly, you have to make sure that all the use cases, corner cases, we can cover and test, validate. If we can achieve that quickly, relatively quickly, for example, performance testing might take some time to finish. And how easy to can achieve that? So now I'm not seeing a very easy way to achieve all these objectives. So the lead time to code, that's one of the challenges that we are facing.
Yeah, I always thought in this industry it was always bad to try to measure success in CI/CD based on the number of times without this idea. I always thought it was better to think about this from a perspective of the ability to ship software when it's ready, and this hard definition of getting to the point where you can prove that something is ready. I think that's kind of the challenge. And I see you nodding over there, Stefan. You want to jump in here and add something to it?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of think of there as being a few big challenges. The first one's verification. Like, does the software even work? Do you have enough integration tests and automated testing in place that you can ship safely? Because if you do CD and you can't do it safely, it's just going to result in the entire rest of the org not wanting you to just do CD because you're breaking them. There's usually also a lot of organizational momentum and roadblocks that can make it hard to do CD. So the first team I ever had that was doing CD for a customer facing product, not an internal tool, was at a company that had, regular reviews with our field, enterprise software. So we're holding our customers' hands, and everyone in the field wanted to know everything that was shipping for any customer ever saw it, and we weren't doing feature flagging yet. So we finally managed to get the rest of the company to agree, give us a week's notice before you ship something and we'll be okay with that. Now, is that CD? No. But when you consider everything else was oriented for you're shipping once a month at most, it was still a step in the right direction. So there's a lot of compliance, there's a lot of verification. Are you getting security scanners run? Are you communicating what needs to happen to really do CD well? And if you start doing continuous deployment to production and you're not ready and you take down production, it's just going to result in you making enemies who don't want you doing it.
I kind of hold the unpopular opinion that if you can consistently give a week's notice and then ship on time with that week's notice, I think that level of consistency could be considered continuous. I think there are things that are super complex, and if that's part of your process, I think that's okay too. I want to get over to Tracy. As someone that has kind of presided over this foundation, my guess is you've seen this from all angles, from the vendor perspective, from the customer perspective. I'm pretty sure your technical background, you've probably seen it hands-on. What would you add to this? Why is it still so hard?
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of recurring themes we tend to see in the community. And one is the whole shift to distributed systems. So even though we've been releasing software for decades and decades, with this recent shift to platforms like Kubernetes, all of a sudden there's an explosion of environments, and that introduces complexity, and it introduces a whole set of different tools. And then the other side we tend to see is, and this is something that reflected in our State of CD report, was that it tends to be the really experienced folks who are able to achieve those high rates of deployment. So for whatever reason, I think complexity is at the heart of it, but I don't think we're doing a good job to onboard new folks into this space and get them to a position where they can be helping support that continuous delivery in a more regular fashion.
It's been my experience industry-wide. Just, I've been in this business for 20 years, and I always thought about CI/CD as a reflection of your own engineering maturity. Whatever that is, it tends to get reflected in the tool. And I'm curious, John, is that something you've kind of seen through a lot of your analysis that you all have done over the years over at DZone, and also in the process of shipping your own software and websites and things like that?
So you're asking about the relation between tooling maturity and practice
Yeah,
maturity?
I think so. I think
here?
when we pose this question that only a small percentage of developers, I think the question was 14%. is there some correlation here to their engineering maturity across the globe and their ability to utilize these tools?
Yeah, so interestingly, so one of the focuses we added last year in some of research was kind of the subjective aspect of delivering software. And so one thing we look at, we always look at experience of software developers, like how many years have you been doing X, Y, and Z relevant tasks. But in addition to asking about practices and judgments about practice, we asked about anxiety levels. So something we did notice is that of course, things like having more manual deployment steps, in other words, having less tooling or less mature tooling, that tends to increase anxiety. But it actually tends to increase anxiety less for more experienced developers, which to me suggests, I think, that the more experienced developers just understand better that some manual checks are needed and some manual checks are not needed. That's one thought, rather than completely automating things. Another thing that seems to relate like maturity and or experience and like release frequency and use of tooling was that I forget the exact numbers, but by a very significant margin, developers, or I should say software professionals, 80% of whom in our respondent set were developers, were more likely to have less of a distance between their subjective judgment of whether there was enough testing and the results of enough testing. In other words, how frequently you had to roll back a deploy in a way that was not planned because something actually went wrong in production. So the thought there is that as you become more experienced, you not only know how to design systems that can be delivered more continuously, but you also have a better sense before you actually release of how likely it is that something is going to go wrong.
You know, I wonder how much confidence plays into this, because I know there were times where I felt that I could just fix it quickly if it did break, right? You import that new library to replace another library, you refactor the code, you think things still work, but there's this confidence level you have that even if it doesn't work, I think I can fix it within an hour. So move forth. Robert, you talked a little bit about having good test coverage and getting to the point where you can get to that confidence level. Is that kind of what you were hinting at earlier when it talks about, you know, having all of these attributes covered in a testing or staging environment?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a staging environment, from my experience, this is the environment where right before we get to production, if all the test cases, test coverage can support the use cases or in production, then we should help us feel confident to get to the production.
So I want to encourage everyone that's attending live today. We do have live Q&A, and we actually have our first question from Thomas. And I'm going to go around to each of the panelists. I'm going to start with you, Tracy. Could you describe a trait to look for in a new hire who will be tasked with CD ownership?
Wow. Yeah, no, great question. So definitely like the confidence you touched on earlier, but then just the sheer resilience. I think it's a special type of folks who just run on the front lines of keeping software.
I would, if you can spell it, I give you, a good starting point. So if you can spell CI/CD, we can start the conversation there. I at least want you to be aware that it's a thing. How about you, Stefan? What was a good trait you look for if you're going to have someone come in and they want to kind of lead an organization's CD efforts?
So there's a couple traits that have been common in everyone I've seen do really well there. One was, I've never seen anyone successfully drive like anything with CD unless they, have some level of like Linux sysadmining experience. Like they have to understand the ops side, not just the engineering side. And the other one that has been always there in folks I've seen be successful is having some level of perfectionism. Good enough is never enough for them. They always want to be better. They want to empower other people. They don't want to they own everything, but they also want to drive the organization to doing things better than they do today.
I like that. I think also one trait I think is good is someone that's willing to understand that you have to learn what the current process is first. I don't know if there's like a vanilla rub some CI/CD on it and then you're good situation. John, what about you? What are some good traits that you see in someone that, you can come in and say, hey, you can lead this?
So we don't have any dedicated DevOps people, but we do have DevOps work that's done, and it's done by developers. And definitely what Stephen was saying about knowing Linux, knowing sysadmin stuff, that absolutely helps a ton. I would say, conjoined to his other point though about attention to detail, and this is going to sound developer-y, but I think laziness as sort of a trait that does not interfere with perfectionism is good, because one of the things about delivering software is there's a lot of painful, meticulous, boring work to fiddle with things to get it right, unless you have really good automation. And so desire to not do those painful, boring things is a good sign to me. It means you're going to bother to automate things up front and write good tests and all that.
John, let's click into this lazy thing quite a bit, because I've heard that throughout my career, and some people may not understand what we mean by that. Is it this concept that you don't want to repeat these tedious tasks over and over again, so you want your future self to avoid that kind of work, so you're willing to not be lazy up front? Is that where you're getting at?
Yeah, I guess you're right. I should clarify. I don't mean that a person has bad work ethic. I mean, the best developers and DevOps and ops people that I know are extremely hard workers and will be, sad, but will be willing to stay up however late it takes to get something working. Here, by lazy, I agree, means not okay with doing boring work, would rather replace 2 hours of boring work repeatedly with, 3 hours of good work once. That's one thing I mean by it. The other thing is, I think there's sort of a self-deprecating attitude that developers at least sometimes project, which is when you say, I don't like doing miserable, boring things, instead of saying that, which sounds a little like, oh, I'm an engineer, I'm above it all, you just say, I'm lazy. So it doesn't mean that you don't work hard. It does mean that you actually feel like you should be worrying about more important things, which means you want to get rid of the less important, quote unquote, less important things. Even though they're crucial, you want to let the software handle that.
Yeah,
does that answer your question?
No, it does. And I think there's a lot of value in that. One person, just like our software libraries, one person goes off and builds a TLS library. That means no one else in that ecosystem has to go back and learn all of those things in the RFCs and implement them appropriately. So if you get a step correct in the CI/CD pipeline, you ideally do it for everyone that's trying to ship software to your company. And I think that has been the superpower of someone in that DevOps kind of role, that I can take a process, automate it away, and give an interface instead. I'm going to go to you, Robert, in terms of this question of, when you're hiring people to lead these CI/CD efforts, what traits do you look for in someone that you want to bring onto a team?
Yeah, for me, it's important, other than technical aspect, if somebody where you have a solid like coding backgrounds, some development experience, and a system knowledge, for example, in application stack from storage, network, operating systems. If somebody has some experience, understand how these different components layer of application service, how they interact with each other, they doesn't have to be super expert, but they should have some strong knowledge. So other than the technical aspect, I'm looking for somebody can really communicate well. In my experience, more often than not, I noticed some of the issue when it comes to infrastructure or pipeline. Perhaps there's some lack of communication or not sufficient communication between developers, QE, product management, release manager, and persons involved in DevOps or SRE. For example, some of the infrastructure change or how things are labeled. If they not communicate well in advance, that may end up with issues. Or some of the new tooling people publish. It's very important to get buy-in, all the stakeholders involved, what the new tooling, how the architecture will work. Then to help to engage our customers, meaning the DevOps customer, meaning developers, release managers. So they all know ahead what to expect the change to be. For example, I worked with Armory a year or two ago closely for moving the DCD from TeamCity to Spinnaker. So that took a process, come up with the plan, architecture, communicate with all the stakeholders, engineers mostly, and communicate through this whole process from planning to execution. Then the process becomes a lot more smooth.
Awesome. So our next pre-planned question was, what role should manual approvals have in my continuous delivery journey? And I think there's a question from the audience that actually encapsulates a little bit of that one. So I'm going to pivot to that audience question instead. And this one's from Michael Jenkins. And I don't know if that's really his last name, but it's very suitable to this conversation. His question is, I feel like many of my systems are very manual in terms of not having testing in place for CD. What levels of testing is enough for a true delivery in CD? Maybe we'll start with you on this one, Stefan.
So one of the things that I realized after I came to Armory that most surprised me is for many of our customers, we've got some aggregated usage information around the pipelines they execute. And the most common stage in especially early customers' pipelines is a manual approval stage. And when customers are first starting out on their CD journey, they haven't automated everything, so they're doing manual approvals instead. But it still gets them the pipeline, the initial process. Until you have that, you don't even know what those manual steps are half the time. And then you can start looking at those manual approvals and going, okay, cool. Which one of these steps is the slowest and most painful? And that's the one you automate first. So my personal opinion is that no one wants to be at manual approvals, but they can be a useful step to get to where everything is automated, because they can help you figure out what the manual steps of your process are and how long and painful they are, so you can prioritize automating them.
Let's swing it over to you, Tracy. You probably get a lot of organizations that reach out and like, we want to do CD the best. But the reality is someone wants to approve that change or open or close a ticket first. What do you think about this idea that, where do manual, I guess, checks and approvals fit into this flow? And then even more to the question, how much testing is enough to feel confident that you can actually leverage a process like this?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think we get a lot of folks who come in and they're always like, rate my CD, or rate my pipeline. And I think it is a judgment call. Like typically the approach is continuous improvement. You always want to be getting a little better than you were before. And the industry you're in also makes a difference. So we know some folks who tend to have a lot more regulation and compliance. It's harder for them to get away from, like, get rid of all the manual checks or specific manual checks. So I think bearing those two things in mind and then kind of making a judgment call on, what does the testing that is automated cover? What would you do if, for whatever reason, people couldn't be there, and how would that affect your delivery flow? And kind of finding a good trade-off. Just keeping in mind, yes, it's a continuous improvement journey, and there's no real destination, so there's no sort of enough.
I think, John, you mentioned this a little bit earlier as well. So when you think about, how does a team sit down and measure this? Is this something you can kind of look at your pipeline, look at your code base and say, look, we hit that coverage boundary? Because I know some people got a false sense of security by having just test coverage be really high. What are your thoughts around what is enough test coverage in order to do CD properly?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So, of course, it's very hard to come up with a good objective measure of test quality. That's a thing that's going to require a lot of judgment calls on the part of both the developers and also, like, say, business analysts or people who really understand realistic use cases. We actually have a little bit of numbers on this. So given that it's hard to come up with really objective measures, we did ask what percentage of your code is covered by unit tests, right? And also, at the same time, we correlated that with how often do you have to roll back unexpectedly. And it looked like there was actually a decrease in frequent rollbacks until you hit 75% or so. And then there continued to be a decrease, but it really leveled off. So it seemed like, at least in the judgment of the respondents, we don't have objective data on this, right? But in the judgment, the benefits of test coverage kind of amortized not as effectively, or after you hit about 75%. I don't want to say, therefore, you should do 75%. It's quite possible that because these are semi-round numbers, the respondents are kind of rounding in their heads. But it definitely is the case, at least, that it looks like in the judgment of developers, getting crazy high is going to give you diminishing returns after around that level.
Yeah, one thing I think is important to talk about too is I've actually been a part of a team who've had a fully automated pipeline have to introduce a manual step because they lost the trust of their teams. It's like, whoa, for the last week, things have been going down every single day. That's one thing we're not going to do continuously, bring down production. So now, until you earn trust back, we're going to have to go into a manual check mode just to make sure we can cut this off, because your customer cannot tolerate sometimes, frequent outages. And honestly, sometimes you just have to, raise the flag and say, hey, we got to hit pause on the train until we get back to where the organization can trust that it always goes. I'm going to give you one chance to respond as well, Robert. How do you think about, getting to or measuring a suitable level of test coverage to feel comfortable adopting CD?
Well, I guess we mentioned that earlier is we need to, if we have already strong knowledge about what use cases, realistic use cases of the end user, and we can set a test environment for that, that should really help to get to a CD. But even for manual, but one quick thing about manual check, you probably also, we need to have the infrastructure to support the manual check too, because you ask a manager to check that, well, then how do they make that decision? They need information, right? So the decision making still should be data driven. And that's the one aspect is if we have a customer for, well, one more practical example I can come up with. So I'm not my team supporting a donation for philanthropy organizations. So in this situation, we know exactly how donors and recipient work with each other, right? The payment system, when you start a donation, how does it get received, where the records, how to keep track of these records. If a donation record lost, then how do you recover that? So if we need to have this test environment, and more importantly, how to recover issue quickly, then you probably the CD can move quicker, meaning may say instead of 1 month, maybe 1 week. Currently, we do have really release in one of the services I support. So even for manual, the manual approval probably still required, but that's probably just a business aspect of things. You have the development manager and quality leadership to sign off things, but they do need to record the data to support. Okay, they can sign off.
Yeah, and for those that are listening and you're trying to imagine, like, how would you do this? Of course, tools like Spinnaker can, you can embed a manual step in the actual CI/CD pipeline itself. So people that have access to the console can definitely click on that button and even put in a reason. But in my experience, I tend to try to hook up those systems to the one everyone in the organization uses. So as someone who used Jira back in the day, I had the ticketing system hooked up to those manual steps. So the pipeline would actually generate the data. This RPM is signed by this QA team. And all of that metadata would then be into a custom ticket type. And then that custom ticket type would be then assigned to whoever in that workflow needed to approve. So then that person could go to the Jira ticket, review the information. And we always forget, sometimes there's a conversation like, who approved this change? Can we do this month? Are we out of our error budget? And once everything is resolved, then that ticket becomes like a record or recording of how we arrived to yes. Then someone can move that ticket to another state. And then your automation tool is still at the ready to take that approval and then continue down the pipeline while appending messages, letting people know the results of their approved change. So just understand that it may be something where you need to integrate into existing approval flows to make this work. I was concerned earlier that we wouldn't get enough questions from people, but we're getting a ton of them. So I'm going to keep with the audience questions. Some of them are overlapping with our pre-questions. So we're going to keep rolling with that. I guess this next question is kind of on this general theme. What advice do you have to encourage trying CD? I hear concerns about not enough tests, or I need to manually approve before going to production. I think that's on the same thread. Maybe you can jump back in, Tracy. When people come in, and also I think there's this thing that's happening here. I'm noticing that people are very careful not to combine CI and CD together. I think people are being very cautious about CD being something very distinct there. Maybe Tracy, you can dig into that a little bit. How do you go about encouraging people to think about CD? And then if you can, how do you think about the differences between CI and CD?
Yeah, no, I think it's something that comes up a lot. And like some people, we have an end user council in the Continuous Delivery Foundation. And I found that's been one of the most effective ways where folks who are building the systems and putting them together just come along and then share what they're doing and share what they're learning. And you can see that there's definitely a lot of folks who tend to lurk because they, for whatever reason, maybe they've just adopted Git and they've got CI put together and they're feeling rather proud, but then they come along and they hear some of the other folks who have all these, really fancy things and like progressive delivery and canary deployment. So I think the first thing is just, to meet yourself where you are in the first place, and then look at examples of what folks in similar areas or similar types of company are doing. And we have an amazing set of projects like within CDF. So the barriers to entry are really low because you can get started with open source projects like Spinnaker. But yeah, just starting, putting a foot in the ground with anything, even if it's a docs project, if that's a lower bar, starting somewhere and then continuously improving and just learning from others.
Steph, I'm going to go to you. I'm going to put a little spice on this. Should every company in the world have a CD process?
I would actually say yes to that. The question is, what are you continuously deploying? So, if you're trying to get buy-off on CD and your business is not willing to let you do CD to prod, they're terrified of it. Set up a staging environment, do CD there, and start tracking your tickets. So, in most companies, there's a concept of ship stopping bugs versus non-ship stopping bugs. And if you're not doing CD, you're probably doing, a few sprints of development and then like a hardening sprint. And then you go and you fix the things you found in your hardening sprint. So report on, hey, here's the things we actually found and fixed in that hardening sprint. Go and figure out what tests you need to add that would have caught those. Get that list down to where there's nothing anyone's really willing to hold the ship for. And take that staging environment, give everyone access to it. So your sales org, your marketing org, et cetera, all have access to the new version in it via a instance that is being continuously delivered. And suddenly you're switching the conversation to be, I can touch it here. Why can't my customers access it yet? And you're like, well, you're not letting me ship it. This is the extent of the impact of we're getting out of shipping it. And by being able to show that, at some point people are going to go, there's not enough on that list that it's worth it. Like the time delay is costing me more than shipping with those issues would. And then they'll let you do CD.
I like that. The Jedi mind trick. That's a nice way to kind of frame it up. I often think that you're probably doing CD. It's just that you are the individual, that meat cloud of folks that are just build guide and doing everything manually. That is still your process. It's just that there are better tools to help. John, how do you jump into that? How do you get people, to buy in that this is something they should take on?
Yeah, actually, the technique that Steven mentioned, we just sort of adopted by accident. So we had one client, so we do consulting work, and one of our clients was all like, everything has to be really, really slow, and we have to review everything. And there was ridiculous checking sign-off processes, even for things like what should the drop shadow look like. So we did we'll just set up your testing org, and we'll do a continuous delivery process in there. It wasn't the most mature process, but it was at least allowed us to just fire things off multiple times a day. And then some of the people who weren't originally involved in any kind of like UAT testings, who were only supposed to be involved in the sign-off process at the very end, they started poking around in that environment, and they were happy with it. And they were like, wow, there's so much is happening here. And they're like, well, what's happening? We were like, well, you insist on these big gated deploys with like 72 new features and stuff. And so exactly what you were doing, Steven, we didn't even think of it consciously, but it was just, we're like, well, fine, you do what you want. We're going to do this so we can poke around with it continuously. And then they saw how much easier that was and so they actually are saying like, well, at least we need to do more frequent releases than once every 3 months, which is what they were doing before.
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand what people are doing instead. When you go to your team and say, what are we doing instead then? And you ask someone to write it down, and you might find it's hard for one person to write down the process end to end. They may not even know. And I think once you can even just put it on paper, as arcane as that sounds, but if you could say, when someone makes a change, here's everything that happens, including tagging something, building it, packaging it, the whole nine, and people can step back and see it all, and then see how much time that goes into it, that might be enough to say, hey, if this is exactly what it takes to get something there and we can verify it, sometimes you can just come back to work and say, I want to show you all something. if you check in code here, I've encoded all the things that you wrote down in the doc. So I'm not skipping anything. We're still doing everything, but here is the full pipeline that does it. Now, if any of these things you would like to put a manual check, here's where you insert those. But we do have the power to automate these things and at least have something that's a little bit more repeatable. And sometimes that might be a good way to show people we're already doing this stuff. But what are computers for? And then sometimes it can click for some people that maybe they should use the computers to do those. John, I'm going to take it to you before we get to the next question. You know, what did you do maybe specifically if you've ever joined a company and they're not quite on board? And there's a lot of companies where there are some teams that are on board with CD, but some other teams are just like, nah, we'll keep our process that we already have. Have you ever run into those issues? And then what'd you do to get those teams on board?
So let me see. I haven't run into those at the companies that I have worked at as an employee, but I've definitely run into that in companies that I have contracted for. And in that case, so a couple of things where, I'll give you more or less helpful. One is that, you need, in my experience, it helps to have somebody who was not an actual developer champion continuous delivery, because sort of everyone is like, well, of course the developers want to do this, right? I ended up just saying like, well, such, Dimitri or whatever, you have a good relationship with this person who's a release manager of some kind. Why don't you invite him in and we can give him a little presentation? Not something that as a consultant I really could have done exactly given the thing that I was doing, but that relationship helped. One other thing that was somewhat helpful, I think, was really walking through some of the development teams that we were going to, again, this is specific to consulting, that we're going to hand code off to, really walking them through our code and talking to them about the unit tests, allowing them to have some stake in what we were going to, what cases we were going to cover, and to make sure that the integration tests were adequate to their infrastructure and all of that. That helped because then they weren't just seeing something like it's breaking or it's not breaking, because they knew why things were breaking or not breaking when we were running our test suites. They could feel confident that it was meaningful enough to release to production. The third thing that I thought helped a little bit was that, there were absolutely, in my experience, there are like different cultures in different companies. So one client I'm thinking of is they're like an outdoors, they manufacture stuff that cool people have when they're hiking. The tech side of that, the IT side of that was actually like that as well. They were really casual and like fun and hanging out. Oh, let's do fun modern things and sort of, reliably and responsibly, but do new things. Whereas I'm thinking of another like old manufacturing company tended not to be like that at all. I didn't come up with, in the latter case, that was where the relationship really helped a lot, where like they needed people relationships to build trust. They didn't care about the sort of pure principles. In the former case, that's where just, showing them successful, like how quickly we released things, that helped a lot. So.
Awesome. So this next question, I'm going to start with you, Robert, on this one. Should I tackle continuous delivery or continuous integration first? So I'm going to add one more thing to that. Could you describe the differences between CI and CD before you answer that question?
Yeah, from my experience, the CI CD, of course, they're very different. CD more concerning, more deploying your application service into production. That's primarily CD is about the deployment orchestration aspect of things. The CI is more concerning checking a new code, how well you run unit tests, functional tests, integration tests, and then only publish the binaries, or I should say, label the primary binary for tagging. Let's say this is ready for next phase, for example, staging further testing. Otherwise, right, whatever the binary you have should not be used for further down the pipeline. So the kind of simple description of difference between CI and CD. And the question regarding should we tackle CI or CD first? I will look at from one angle is how easy to pick the right binary from the CD aspect to pick that directly into the production or testing or any environment you have support. By that I mean, as I say, let's say if you are binary management system as Nessus, Artifactory, or wherever, if from the CD side, let's say I'm only responsible for deploy a binary. How easily for me to identify that binary? Then I can probably as long as I can achieve that, then I probably can set up the CD relatively quickly through Spinnaker or other tools. Because you have the starting point, right? There's a connection between CI and CD. The CI production is the binary code of particular configuration required by CD. From CD side, if I cannot find that easily, then there's no point to worry about the CD aspect of things. Then I will set up a CI for whether it's Jenkins or whatever tooling or homemade tooling or customized for whatever you use. Then we need that the CI output, we need to have a high level of confidence whatever output from the CI is ready for shipment. Then I would need to I will worry about CI first if I cannot have high confidence on the output of the CI.
So I'm going to throw one more wrench into this, Robert.
Yeah.
We tend to think about this handoff process, right? You know, in the CI component, you're producing some artifact, and for people listening, a binary could be an RPM, it could be an ELF binary, it could be a container image. And then we think about picking that up in our CD process and getting that to the right target systems. Where does configuration fit into all of this, right? Like these environments tend to have, you know, different database connection strings, different features that need to be turned on via configuration depending on where you are. Where's that sit in this process?
The configuration should be part of the, it should apply for both CI and CD, meaning I say if you deploy, if I use Terraform as example, where we try to put for us or for many companies or our teams already try to define the configuration in code. For example, in Terraform, you define all the metadata required for, let's say, AWS instance or whatever cloud instance may be, right? So that need to be a code somewhere. So the implication here, there has to be a very secure way of reading this code or secrets required for deployment. So that part of service, like the configuration management or secret management, could be shared between CI and CD. You don't have two separate repository for Terraform code, right? Or secret management key. Although you do need some kind of convention, let's say the production deployment should be restricted to, the production secret should be only restricted to a particular person, human or not, or service user, right? Obviously, you don't want those type of secret widely available for anybody.
Yeah, I used to do this bad thing, and I think it was a bad thing. I used to try to make sure that no one had to think about the configuration too much. Like I used to sometimes say, this pipeline is for going to staging. I know I can make it more configurable, but I just don't want you to type in the wrong thing. So if you click this button, it's going to go to staging, right? And what's going to go to staging is the binary you pick. So I try to reduce the number of like drop downs and things you had to pick before you do those things. I'm gonna modify the question just a little bit for you, Stephen. Can you just have one without the other? And describe what that looks like. Like if you only had CD, what are you doing for CI? And if you only had CI, what are you doing for CD?
So I think you can, but I also think that if you're doing CI without CD, you're probably not really doing true CI. Every time I've seen companies doing CI without CD, they are continuously running unit tests, and they almost always have some set of integration tests that are still manual. Or they're starting with test cases they want to do integration tests for, and they're going, well, I can't do this because I don't have a deployed environment, and they're tweaking them a little bit such that they're not actually testing what they originally set out to test. So, you know, when I think of it, I go, you know, step one is unit tests. Get to where, you know, you're finding most of your issues with unit tests as quickly as possible. Then go do CI, get an environment stood up that is as close to production as you possibly can make it. And then start doing CI and writing continuous integration tests on that environment that are running.
Describe an integration test.
Describe an
integration test, because we're assuming everyone knows the difference between a unit test and an integration test. Maybe describe to people how those things are different, and then what is an integration test?
So an integration test is really a test that spans multiple different services. So I like to think of it as a test that spans and that tests that an entire use case is working end to end, as opposed to just, hey, this particular function of this particular class is doing what I expected. Um, the things I expect CI to find is one dev working over in this piece of code, another dev working over on this piece of code, did different things, and they affected each other in ways they never could have seen coming, such that there was an unexpected downstream side effect.
Or the database schema change is still
right.
compatible with the app.
Yeah. So like the most recent integration test my team built is we're working on a SaaS-based deployment solution, and we're going, well, like, what is our primary, like, how do we measure uptime? And usually people go, well, I'm going to just like check, hey, is it responding? And we went, no, we're going to hook up an integration test that deploys a simple application, puts it through a best practice pipeline that well exercises the system, and make sure it deploys. And we're just going to run that every 5 minutes as our health check. And then we also put that in as an integration test in our deployment pipeline. So taking things that are end to end like that and getting them as integration tests can help you find a lot of bugs you're missing. I've at past companies, I've mined trainings for, hey, these are things people think should never break. Hey, this is the training that we're giving our customers. Hey, let's take that. Hey, this is a standard sales demo. Hey, let's take that. These are all things you can mine that can get integration tests that are going to catch things that break that would never be caught via unit test.
Awesome. So look, we're going to move. We got 15 minutes left. Look how time flies. You all are doing a really great job of answering these questions. The audience, thank you for providing questions. We got one more for the audience I'm going to weave in, and then we're going to go into a different style. I'm going to probably just ask one question uniquely to each of you. And if you want to add something to it, you can just raise your hand and you can append something to it. So this question, I think I'm going to give this question to John. And John, this question is around feature flags. Can you address how feature flags can impact the testing needed for CD?
So I can speak about this subjectively from my experience. I'm using feature flags, and then also we have a little bit of also subjective but survey-based data on this again. My experience is that feature flags shouldn't really affect any kind of automated testing you're doing at unit or integration testing, but it's really okay for people to, and people will start feeling more confident that they don't have to manually test everything before sign off if there's a feature flag. So the trick there, the hard part about that is making the feature flag sufficiently granular or hierarchical so that dependencies are not introduced by enabling or disabling something that might be trickier to test for if you weren't thinking about feature flags. So basically, in other words, your integration tests are going to have to factor in that some elements are going to be turned on or off, by somebody in production independently of a deployment. That's my sort of subjective experience. I mean, it should up your complications of integration testing.
And maybe for people that are new to feature flags, what are they? And then what do they allow you to do, for example?
That you can say, it's basically a switch that you can turn on that says like this feature should be available or this feature should not be available for users. So the code is going to be the same, but the functionality will be X or not X, depending on what you've set, how you set this flag. And again, there can be complicated relationships here, right? Like you're not going to expose this, which means you're going to do this calculation differently and so forth.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of companies, we have this thing in our mind that code is done once we check it in, when we kind of know that isn't true. Some features just take a long time to get to the point where they're really ready to go. So we don't want to have this trade-off where we're saying hold back that code and not check it in. We rather you consistently check in that code, even though it's not going to be used or shouldn't be used in production, because we want the integration test to also surface where your refactorings may be causing a problem, even though your feature isn't live. And if we can assure the world that if we turn off that feature, it shouldn't impact anything else. And I think that gives us that courage to say, yeah, check in things as frequently as we tend to deploy them. And I think that's one kind of benefit of this feature flag is that I think most people get into trouble when they hold things back for like a month and then try to do one big merge. And then it's like, we got to redo everything because we didn't learn anything as we were going. I think you said you had another part from your survey data about the impact of feature flags on the CD process.
Yeah, we tried to correlate the use of feature flags with the experience of releases. And again, this is somewhat complicated by the fact that people, the respondents who use feature flags are also more likely to be more mature in other ways with respect to continuous delivery metrics. But so trying to do our best to kind of factor that in. Feature flags seem to enable more frequent releases, particularly multiple time a day releases. That was the biggest gap between those who use and those who don't use feature flags, was in the percentage of respondents who release multiple times a day. They also are more likely, the respondents who use feature flags are less likely to require manual steps for production deployment significantly, which is kind of what I was saying before. Like people feel more comfortable just saying, okay, let it through, I can always turn it off later. Interestingly, we also noticed that when that users who use feature flags, and this might be just a confounded result, but I thought that it was interesting that the teams that use feature flags are also more likely to have more distributed responsibility across developers and release managers and like a whole separate organization for releases, which again, in my mind, makes sense because if you're developing a feature flag, then the developer already is thinking about something that's happening in production independent of the code that was actually released.
Awesome. I'm going to swing this question to you, Tracy. Oh, you want to go ahead and add to this? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add, there's a big thing I really like as a product manager with feature flagging as well, which is it lets us, keep everything running on multi-tenant software and ship the feature, but I can turn it on for one customer and I can have that customer try it out before I tell it to everyone else. And if only a couple known people are using it, I can still make breaking changes while I'm getting feedback. Once I give it to everyone, that's a much harder thing to do. So I really like it from the standpoint of being able to try it with just a few people, get feedback, action it before it goes everywhere.
And maybe it's important to talk about how you turn this stuff on and how you turn this stuff off, right? So if you do turn it on, you also get this power to turn it off. Tracy. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, so there have definitely been situations where, hey, we're considering having this feature be something you have to pay extra for. If it's built behind a feature flag, you can suddenly turn it off and not have to go add extra features for that, which is not something anyone ever wants to be doing purpose-built dev for.
All right, so this one's for Tracy. Of all the stuff you've seen, I'm sure you've seen a lot. What common mistakes are people making out here?
Yeah, no, I think not implementing things like or not treating it as part of the business. Like we're just seeing software in everything, and CI/CD is such a differentiator. I think people can't afford to not be pushing forward in the right way. I think there's a lot of hesitation or not knowing where to start, and then the other side as well. We're starting to see more and more kind of with open source projects, and we touched on the topic of configuration earlier. So I think, configuration as code, moving down that path, approaching it with best practices like pinning your dependencies and things like that, it should actually make things easier in the long run. But I think biggest mistake is people just being hesitant about moving forward when it's like just absolutely critical to the business.
Are there any industries that kind of get this right? If I were to use a quick example, you think about car manufacturing, the pipeline for producing cars is critical to the business, right? If that doesn't work, they can't get the things shipped, they can't get them out for delivery, and the car manufacturer is just not considered successful. So it's almost like how good is your ability to produce cars is one-to-one correlated to that business. Is there any other industries, or I guess, is that how people should be thinking about software themselves as they produce this software? Should they be thinking about how effective their business is on being able to get those things out?
Yeah, and if I can speak to that. In one of the reports we did, we did take a look by industry at the level of performance, both measured in terms of speed and stability. So how quickly can you recover services? And by far and away, retail were ahead of the curve. So if you can't ship things quickly in retail, you're kind of dead in the water. And then other industries like finance were starting to improve a lot. And then way on the other spectrum, you did have things like telecoms. So I think it does depend a little on your industry. But I think at any point, if you've got a new player in that industry who does take advantage of CI/CD, then that can be a game changer for the whole space.
I'm going to swing this question over to you, Robert. Like we've talked about a lot today. How long does this stuff take to get off the ground, right? Is this something where you go online and you download the thing that has the best logo, install it, and a week later you're off to the races? Give us a real world timescale of thinking about onboarding and adopting this stuff.
Well, I guess depends on complexity of the service you try to support. But in general, to me, it's very important to define what you're trying to achieve with CI/CD. To me, first and foremost, is to deliver products in a secure, reliable manner. That means you need to have all this infrastructure, all this is ready, right? Tooling already to kick off something, to kick off the CI/CD effort. Meaning, how long it take? Well, again, this one depends on complexity. But so first, you have to have a very clear idea what the service you try to deploy, which is to support what's the end goal, right? Start from there, then work back to setting up an environment, human resources, infrastructure resources. That will really help you to have a better idea how long it might take for you to finish to get that off the ground.
So listening to your response there, could people end up making the mistake? Let's say that the mobile team decides that they want to get in on that CD and they find something that just works really great for deploying to iOS app stores or Android Play Store. But then that might be the wrong tool for someone that wants to deploy to, I don't know, let's say Kubernetes or something like that. How do you think about that? Should companies be okay with maybe having even multiple CD solutions depending on the problem set?
You can have different solutions, but I would say all these solutions need to be work together. For example, if you have a mobile solution, app or whatever, that may be still talking to a backend, which could be a database or server. I mean, that happen quite often in, let's say, online game, right? You have things on your mobile, you're playing a game, but the back-end service is some data center somewhere. So these two need to be coordinated very closely together. I mean, the infrastructure, underlying infrastructure itself should be fairly similar. For example, you're checking the code, constructing and building the code, probably go through the same system, whether it's Jenkins, TimeCity, or whatever you use. And on the distribution part, maybe a little bit different. Even deployment part may be a little bit different. Obviously, you're pushing the code to a phone, obviously different from, let's say, to a Kubernetes cluster. But the infrastructure support both, as let's assume whether it's Spinnaker or whatever tooling can support both, then you can use the same infrastructure to carry out, to support the delivery, right? But
Awesome.
again, but some of the aspect of this, whether different service products, the several type of service all kind of horizontal. For example, permission management, secret management, storage. You need to store something somewhere, S3 bucket, whatever. So those policies should be consistent regardless which service you deploy.
Awesome. We got 3 minutes left. I'm going to go around and give everybody a chance to maybe say their final words and, maybe give a few things that maybe we didn't talk about really quickly here. So I'm going to start with you, Stefan, on this one.
Yeah. So, I kind of think continuous delivery is a journey. You need to start by getting your simplest tests running and then clone production, deploy to it, get some integration tests running there to prove out confidence. And then you can start deploying to production. I also am of the opinion that, continuous deployment ultimately isn't just about deploying to one place. It's about really your entire software delivery lifecycle. You need to deploy to staging production. You might have multiple productions, and ideally you should have a single view that someone can look at and know where their code has reached and where it hasn't. I also think it's important to be able to anytime you're shipping software, be doing continuous communication around that and make sure that people downstream understand what is coming. You don't want to completely change a UI without telling people it's coming, and they no longer know how to use it.
Awesome. Tracy.
Yeah, no, I think trying to set it up, aiming for that, full automation if you can get there, but just taking the steps every single time and prioritizing the need to just move forward and continuously improve. Where if you're starting with CI, that's great, but do get to CD, and don't get discouraged. And there's lots of folks out there who can help you.
Awesome. John.
The only point I'd like to emphasize, in addition to what other people have already said and what's familiar, is how important that confidence building is. A huge part of the success of a continuous delivery, in my experience, is making sure that everyone is less stressed. And that's also a great benefit of it. And again, in those subjective research we did, that's a big benefit of continuous delivery. It's not just fewer bugs, fewer problems, but also people are just happy about releases instead of miserable.
All right, Robert.
Yeah, I guess maybe I will add CI/CD. CI we already mentioned a little bit, continuous improvement, and continuous maybe CE, continuous engagement, meaning for people in DevOps space continue to engage with our partners, especially new features, new process. Quick example I have is we have a deployment process used to take many hours. We improve simply because we get new knowledge from another senior level engineer. Hey, you need to do things differently. So, but when you're running that day-to-day on pipeline, doesn't mean things don't change. So you got to keep engaged with the people involved with architecture, features, project management, how to improve the existing services and pipeline.
Yeah, I think today was a good reminder that, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And I think a lot of this is about understanding what needs to happen. Every company is a little bit different. Everyone has their own engineering culture and ways of doing things, regulations that they need to adhere to. But it's good to understand exactly what needs to be done to do those things. And if you figure that part out, why not leverage a few automation tools to help everyone else benefit from that? I'd like to thank all of our panelists for hanging out with us today. And I thank all the people who asked their questions and were in attendance. That's the end. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.